Hey, Cory. Hey, Rebecca.
Hi, David.
Hi.
Thanks to both of you for being here. Your new book, I loved. I loved it so much. I think I'm on the back cover of it, saying how much I loved it. It's called Chokepoint Capitalism.
You were actually on the front cover of it. So
the front cover, amazing. Great. Your new book is called Chokepoint Capitalism: How Big Tech and Big Content Captured Creative Labor Markets and How We'll Win Them Back. Okay, so let's start. People have heard the term capitalism, obviously. The modifier of the title is choke point. So to start this discussion, what in general are we talking about when we say choke point capitalism?
So when we talk about choke point capitalism, we're talking about markets where you have producers, either workers or producers of goods and services, and you have customers or audiences. And in between, you have a single company or a small collection of companies that have rigged up a choke point, right? You have to go through them to reach the audience or the customers for your work. And because they have that choke point and because they have a key audience, they can extract whatever they want from you on their way. Now, choke point markets are all over the place. You know, if you want to drive an Uber and I want to get in an Uber, Uber is operating the choke point between us. There's no way for us to get together and do it on our own. But arts markets are particularly susceptible to them, partly because arts workers will keep working no matter what, even if you abuse them. That's that old joke about the kid who runs away and joins the circus and his dad finds him shoveling elephant poop. And he says, son, come home. And he says, what? And quit show business. But also because the main tool that creators are given to improve their negotiating leverage between them and the people who bring their works to market, copyright, is not a good tool for getting through a choke point. Giving an artist more copyright when they have to go through a choke point to reach their audience, it's like giving your bullied kid more lunch money. It doesn't matter how much money you give them, you're just going to make the bullies richer. And, the fact that the bullies are out there saying America's school children are starving and they need more lunch money doesn't actually mean that you're going to solve any problems by giving your kid more lunch money. You have to get the bullies out of the way. You have to clear the choke points.
And so whether you're a fan of capitalism or you think we need to burn it all down, that fundamentally central to it is free competition. And what these choke points are doing, these big businesses are managing to shape markets into these hourglass figures where they're sitting at the middle and there isn't that free competition. And that's what's enabling them to choke creative workers and suppliers and extract more than their fair share of value.
So we're talking about the old phenomenon. It's maybe the oldest phenomenon in capitalism, which is the middleman, right? People are going to recognize that term. Oh, the middleman, right? And the middleman has become kind of this pejorative term. Like there's the buyer and the seller and the middleman, right? The middleman who in the cartoonish portrayal doesn't do anything except really, I guess, connect buyers and sellers, or as you argue, sits there to take a fee to extract rent, if you will, from being in the middle. My question then flows from this is, are there markets, before we get into the ones that are distorted, are there markets where there isn't such a powerful set of middlemen? Wasn't the internet supposed to connect us directly from buyer to seller with fewer and fewer middlemen? Wasn't that the dream of the internet?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that the important thing is not whether you are intermediated, whether there's someone between you and the people who you want to buy or sell with, but it's whether you have a choice of them or someone else. I have a great literary agent who gets really good deals for me, but the Hollywood screenwriters found that all four of the big talent agencies bought up all their competition and then started structuring deals so they could get these packaging fees where the cheaper the writer worked for, the more they would get in packaging fees from the studios. That's the difference. The problem isn't that they're agents, right? The problem is whose side they're on. And the thing that determines that is some mix of regulation and competition. And it's very hard to regulate uncompetitive markets, right? When there's only three companies in a market, they will all show up in front of whoever their regulator is and say everything is fine. And everyone else who shows up to say something else are like, what do these people know? They're not one of the big three. And so you end up with this regulatory capture.
And one of the ways we explain this in the book is by looking at what Amazon loves to boast about. It calls it its flywheel, this self-described virtuous cycle. And the way that it explains it, it says, well, we start with, really great cost efficiencies, and that means low prices. So we attract consumers, and that means that, more suppliers come to the table. And so there's greater product offering, and then the cycle continues, and it's all just very wholesome and great. And what we do is we deconstruct that, and we show that the cycle's not virtuous, it's anti-competitive. Because what they're actually trying to do here, and what Amazon has always tried to do ever since its inception, is to lock in consumers, right? All of its actions around Amazon Prime, for example, are all designed to lock in consumers. I've not been to the States since just before the world ended, and I was, really alarmed to see when I got back to New York that every package almost is one that's got Prime tape on it. I went to Whole Foods. I was confronted with a sign that says, you can just return your Amazon packages here. How easy would that be? And by the way, you get discounts on a whole bunch of groceries if you're a Prime member too. And then you get your free video streaming and free shipping and all of that. It's against an individual's self-interest, or it can feel that way, not to become a Prime member. But of course, once those consumers are locked in, the suppliers are locked in as well, right? They can't afford to give up that enormous share of the market that Amazon controls. And then the profits that Amazon gets from having the consumers and the suppliers locked in, it uses to eliminate competition, which takes away even more choice from them. And then once we're in that position, it ratchets things down. That's where the squeezing really happens. And it forces people like book authors and publishers, but all kinds of other suppliers, to force them to accept prices that, are really not sustainable or fair.
So I want to piggyback off that, because you use Amazon as a specific example. And the first part of what you described, where people are, the package comes to the house, there's an easy way to return it. The return may be at a grocery store, which is also partially Amazon owned. And, you go home and you watch your Prime Video, or you're listening to Amazon Music. And I think a lot of people will hear that and be like, okay, it's kind of creepy that it's one company that I'm whose bubble I'm existing in. But all of those things you've just described to me are things that I actually like, that I don't feel forced into them. I actually feel like Amazon is delivering things to me that I like. What's your response when you hear that from a regular consumer, maybe he's not a political person, who's just like, look, I like all that stuff you just told me about?
Yeah, and on the consumer side, it can look really good. And there's a reason for that. And it's to do with the consumer welfare standard, which has been the dominant standard of US antitrust law for the last 40 years. And I won't get too much into the wonky details of it. But essentially, if you were not raising consumer prices, or at least you were doing it in a way that is plausibly deniable, then you weren't going to have to worry about any trouble from antitrust regulators. So what that led to is less a monopoly problem, which is where it's powerful sellers raising prices on consumers, but a monopsony problem where we get these powerful buyers who are squeezing their workers and their suppliers. And so on the consumer side, everything that Amazon offers might look great to you. You might feel like you get astonishingly good value out of Prime. But what's happening is that by contributing to that system, it allows Amazon to then, on the other end, be squeezing and squeezing and squeezing the publishers and the authors and the other people that are actually supplying those goods. And monopsony is a real problem for a number of reasons. One, it becomes problematic at much lower concentrations than monopoly does. So a buyer that controls even 10% of the market can have a really strong influence on suppliers. But also traditional antitrust remedies have even more difficulty responding to this than they do with monopoly. And so that's why in our book, we look at all of the different legal supports that contribute to allowing these monopsonies to accrue, but also at all of the different things that we can do outside of antitrust to help widen those choke points out and give, those authors and publishers and so on more power. And so that's things like directly regulating buyer power, things like encouraging new entrants into the market, and so on. And we go into a whole bunch of really hopeful interventions, things that we can actually do now if we want everybody in the system to get a fair share. And as a consumer as well, what I would say is, even if you're feeling like you're getting low prices on the Amazon side, these choke points are everywhere. And increasingly, we are all being squeezed by monopoly power, which is most commonly coming from our employers. And if we are getting squeezed by them in the effect that there's downward pressure on our wages, it has the same end result as consumer prices going up anyway. We've got less and less ability to share in to acquire the goods and services that we need.
And, I think that the big firms would like us to believe that you can't have one without the other, right? That it's a condition of having an agent that they're going to take packaging fees. It's a condition of having convenient package delivery that the worker who delivers it's going to be pissing in a bottle and on food stamps. And I think that those are entirely separable, right? It's like Google telling us that if you want a search engine, you have to be spied on. It's pretty clear that you don't have to be spied on to have a great search engine. I mean, we know that because Google didn't used to spy on you, and it had a great search engine. Facebook used to not spy on you, and it had a great social network, right? These things are joined because they are in the parochial interests of the firms that offer them, not because they are, stuck together like peanut butter and chocolate. And, when we, in the book go into the solutions that we propose, they're about structural remedies, right? They're about like changing the structure of the market so that the stuff that we like as creators, as audiences, as consumers, as citizens, as residents, we get to keep. And the parts that we don't like, we get to peel off and throw away.
One of our favorite parts, actually, when we were shopping this book around, was this one editor who said, I love this book and I would buy it, but are you sure you don't want to maybe change all of those solutions? Because there's no individual ones. They're all systemic, right? But we recognize that convenience of, using Amazon, for example, is really important, especially in a world where we're feeling super pressured. We're in jobs that take up a lot of our time in order to be able to make our rent and feed our families. We don't necessarily have a ton of time to be shopping around everywhere and making choices, from other shops. And so some of the remedies we talk about are, well, let's not force everybody to spend useless hours of labor to try and find all of those products in other places. Let's do things like make it legal to bypass digital rights management technology, which was only ever supposed to protect against copyright infringement, and make it so you can install an overlay, a plugin on your browser so that when you are on the Amazon site, you can use it to find the product that you want, and then pop up an option for a local alternative where you can get it really conveniently. We need to think about ways to make it convenient for people to be able to make the choices that are perhaps more in line with their values without just making everybody feel guilty all the time for taking the convenient option.
I want to talk about this from the artist perspective now, before we get to solutions. Digital rights management. There's a fascinating chapter in your book about how, as you just alluded to, this is the essentially encrypting of digital files that was designed to protect the intellectual property, the copyrights, effectively, of the creators, right? Whether it's the book writers, the musicians and the like. It was portrayed as, listen, we're going to create this technology so that your sound file, your book file are going to be encoded and encrypted so they can't be pirated. So that the theory goes, more of the money that it is sold for on the market goes to the creators. And yet in your book, you describe how this may be one of those situations, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I'm not sure how good the intentions ultimately actually were, but the chapter of your book talks about how this idea of protecting the creator in this part of the Chokepoint capitalist economy, this part was flipped on its head and now actually harms creators. Just talk to us about how that seemingly esoteric, that term, digital rights management, how that was a way to help creators and has now been flipped as a weapon against artists, creators, writers, musicians, and the like.
I would say that it was never a way to help creators, although creators were used as a stalking horse for it.
Sure.
Back in 1998, Bill Clinton signed the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and Section 1201 of that says that if there's digital rights management, you can't remove it, not even if the rights holder says you can. So right from that original sin, you can see that if the entity that put the digital rights management on was, back in those days, it would have been a DVD distributor or a video games console company, that you as the copyright proprietor, the people who made that work, because you don't have the right to authorize your customers to remove the DRM, you are locked into their platform. They become a choke point for your work. The audience has the work. They can't move it somewhere else. If you want to reach them, you have to release in the format that's controlled by the people who put the DRM on it. And so that was a pretty minor grift in the 80s, in the 90s rather, but it quickly grew to encompass all sorts of things. Today you see digital rights management on printer ink, and you see digital rights management on coffee pods and all kinds of things. But in particular in the arts markets, it's really bad. So Amazon is a monopolist in audiobooks. They control about 90% of the market, which makes them a monopsonist in audiobooks. Because if you want to sell your audiobooks to people who want to listen to them, you got to go through Amazon. They're the choke point. And they have this rule that if you're going to sell an audiobook on Audible, which is their audiobook platform, you must have DRM. And that means that if I sell you an audiobook that I paid to produce, I put it on Amazon's store, every dollar that you spend on it is a dollar that you're going to have to forfeit if Amazon squeezes me and I'm like, screw you guys, I'm only going to sell somewhere else. I'm not going to sell on Amazon anymore. If you want to follow me somewhere else, you've either got to maintain 2 separate subscriptions, 2 separate platforms, 2 separate libraries, or you got to say, as between like Doctorow, who writes, a book every couple of years I like, and all the books being published, I'm just going to stick with my collection, and you kiss me goodbye. And so that means that the more dominant Audible becomes, the harder it is for creators to assert their economic interests. And the way that plays out is grimly predictable. So the least powerful creators on Amazon's platform sell through something called ACX, which is Audible's self-serve platform. It's for smaller publishers and independents. You go out and you spend thousands of dollars paying a narrator to record, or the platform will hook you up with a narrator, or will agree on a revenue split. And then it goes on ACX, usually with exclusivity. In many cases, it's 7 years of exclusivity. You can't take it off, even though you funded it. And then ACX is your sole retail vendor, and ACX has these really sketchy accounting practices where when you get your royalty statement, it says, you sold 3 copies. That's net of returns. What you don't see is that you actually sold 13 copies. And ACX, if you're a subscriber to Audible, ACX, when you finish listening to the audiobook, it says, hey, do you want to return this and get your monthly credit back? Like if you were unsatisfied with it, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you can get your monthly credit back. And so when they do that, Amazon gets a more satisfied customer, and I lose the royalty. And this all came to light when Amazon accidentally dumped 3 weeks worth of accounting statements on their staff, or on their writers, and Rebecca knows this story very well.
Yeah, so there was a data glitch, and everyone had sort of been suspecting something was up because their sales were going down in a way that didn't make sense. But this data glitch, because the way they reported revenues hid it, they never, they reported on net sales, right? So it was just, here's your ultimate number, never said how many were being returned. But this data glitch showed 3 weeks of returns in a single day. And so that gave authors finally some insight into what was going on. And so those practices Cory was talking about have actually been slightly reformed now, because there was this amazing movement led by an author called Susan May with the hashtag Audible Must Pay, where they drove a campaign for reform. And look, it's still really hard to do. Audible did the very, very minimum that the public shaming required it to do. So there've been some small changes to how they report that sales data. That 7-year lock-in, I believe that's been removed as well. But there's more to this as well. There was someone else who got involved in this campaign called Colleen Cross, a former forensic accountant turned writer of crime fraud thrillers. And she was thinking, well, if they're doing this to us over returns, what else are they doing to us? And she looked at the contracts and she looked at the royalty statements and she noticed, hang on a minute, if they were paying us the way that the contracts say they need to pay us, the amount we're getting paid doesn't actually make any sense. And so that part is still to be resolved. But what she's telling us is that between the wage theft in terms of this con around the returns, but also what seems to be happening with the returns not only being charged once, but potentially even being charged twice, and then the royalties not even being calculated correctly. She says that maybe it's hundreds of millions of dollars in wage theft from these authors. But that's exactly predictable. They've got enough power, and so they use it to shake down the least powerful in the market. And we're seeing Amazon do that again with Twitch just this week, Cory.
Yeah, they bought Twitch Twitch in 2014. Again,
Twitch, the video platform, right?
Yeah, they grow through growth, right? All these tech platforms are not they think that they build themselves as like Willy Wonka, right? But they're just Daddy Warbucks. They go out and they buy all their competitors, Amazon, Google, whatever. Google's a company with 1.5 successful in-house products, right? A search engine and a Hotmail clone. Everything else they do, they bought from someone else. Their whole ad tech stack, their server management, their video platform, their mobile, all of that was something they bought from someone else. Everything else they built in-house is like crashed and burned, right? The Google videos, Google Plus, just the graveyard of Google products is massive. And so Amazon, they bought Twitch, nakedly anti-competitive acquisition, and they said, oh, we're going to have all these efficiencies. Now, the obvious efficiency for Amazon buying Twitch is Amazon is one of the largest wholesalers of bandwidth in the world. They run AWS, their cloud business, and Twitch, its only variable cost is bandwidth, right? The more popular they are, the more they pay in bandwidth. So that seems like a natural. So Twitch has this absolutely unfair split with its creators, a 50-50 split where they keep half the money you earn from your streams. But it turned out that for their A-list creators, they cut a secret deal for a 70-30 split. And last week, they came clean and they said, we feel terrible about how unfair this 70-30 split is. So we're going to bump our best creators down to 50-50 just to make it fair for everyone. They didn't say we're going to level everyone up to 70-30. And the reason for that is we just can't afford to pay our creators because our overheads are so high, because our bandwidth costs so much. And Sam Biddle from The Intercept tweeted about this, and he said, basically Amazon's position is that Amazon charges Amazon so much for Amazon services that Amazon can't afford to pay the workers who make the money for it.
Oh God. I mean, I feel like so much of this ends up right where you described, right there, which is basically it ends up with Jeff Bezos saying, I don't want to accept any less money than I'm currently accepting. Basically, so many of these stories ends up with essentially some oligarch at the very top. It's not, I can't afford this, we can't do this. It's, I don't want to. And that ultimately is the kind of cartoon of a monopolistic oligarch, somebody who it's the ultimate final stage of greed is good. I'm just not willing to give more to the people who are actually creating the actual value here. Now, fortunately for the reader, in your book, Chokepoint Capitalism, you both don't just present the problems related to the rise of the monopolistic or monopsonistic middleman, but you also provide some solutions for combating the worst effects. Is it the standard mantra of just organize for more power, or are there more specific policy prescriptions for this type of capitalism? And then I want to ask, as just an additional point about this, are there parts of the creative world where this paradigm doesn't exist? I'm thinking, for instance, podcasts. Podcasts have a more distributed set of distribution platforms. It feels a little less consolidated. So are there places in the creative space that are doing better than other places when it comes to these kinds of choke points?
Probably a bunch of people who are listening are feeling a lot like us, where you're just really tired of reading books that spend 10 chapters going into great detail about how shit everything is. And then there's one final chapter at the end. It's like a little bit of hand wavy. Oh, well, we don't have time to go into it in any detail, but maybe just a couple of these things, and, things could be better. But that's for another time. We, from the get-go, really wanted this to be a solutions-focused book. So in the first half, we do set out to persuade you that the problem is not that there's not enough copyright or that people aren't trying hard enough. The problem is that there are these big businesses who have created these choke points that they use to extract more than their fair share. And then once we've done that, once you accept that that's the problem, it opens a new way of thinking about what to do about it. What we need is interventions that are going to widen those choke points out and bring competition back into the market. And so we get into like a lot of detail and a whole bunch of a different range of things. And yes, we do talk about, we have one chapter where we talk about collective action in particular. And there's some really inspiring stories there, like when these Uber drivers did a really elegant jujitsu to turn the tables on Uber when it had got rid of their class action rights via contracts. These drivers all coordinated. Tens of thousands of them brought commercial arbitration claims all at once, which ended up costing Uber way more than it would have been if it had just allowed them to have access to justice in the first place. And Uber, of course, went running to the court saying, this is unfair. These people are being mean to us. This was supposed to make things better for us. Like the chutzpah of it. It was extraordinary.
I mean, anyone could see that this clause is unenforceable. Why did you ever let us enforce it? It should be annulled right now.
Except when we want to again.
Right.
It just obviously. Anyway, so, and we also talk about that incredible Hollywood strike against the talent agencies.
Right.
Where the union grounded out for 22 months, 7,000 Hollywood. 7,000 Hollywood writers fired the agents over a single week in order to get rid of those packaging cons, and also the fact that the talent agencies had started their own production houses that they were then using to negotiate with themselves to get deals, which turned out not to be very good for writers. So we do talk about that, but we talk about a whole bunch of other things like transparency rights. Imagine, and you're a creator, this is not very difficult to imagine because this is how it works. You get a very uncertain paycheck, but you don't have basically any entitlement to find out, in many cases, how it was actually calculated or whether there have been any mistakes. It's pay over how your transparency around how your works are being used, how the revenues are being paid, and what your share is. That's something that's already been mandated in Europe through the Digital Single Market Act, and that we'd really like to see elsewhere. But we see the power of that just from that Audiblegate story. It was that data glitch that shone that light and allowed those authors to see what shape their enemy actually had. It's really hard to fight them without that, but it gave them something to mobilize against. And through that, these, relatively powerless, and certainly powerless in isolation writers were able to work together to get real change. But it was the transparency that enabled that. Cory, do you want to talk about some of the other solutions in the podcasting stuff?
So, podcasting is at its root, a very, very simple technology, right? A podcast is a text file, and it says like David Sirota's podcast, episode 1, title, description, MP3. And it's just a link to an MP3 somewhere on the web. That's a really hard market to corner, right? Because all the parts of that are hosted anywhere. In fact, the standard for that little text file even lets you add something to the bottom of it that says, this text file is moved, go look for it somewhere else. And so even if you and your hosting company fall out, you can just notify your whole audience, and their podcatchers, the program they use to listen to podcasts, will just see that and go, oh yeah, okay, I'll go look for it over here. And you just get a clean break. Very portable, very exciting. Then you get companies like Spotify, and Spotify, they bill themselves as having a podcatcher because you can use the Spotify program, the app, to grab these text files, reload them every 30 minutes to see if there's been a new episode added. When you find the new episode, download it and listen to it through Spotify. But you can also access entries in Spotify's internal database that you can only access using Spotify's own client. And those entries are for podcasts and podcast companies that Spotify has bought. So they bought out Science Versus and Reply All and that whole network. They also, bought out Joe Rogan and gave him $100 million to become a Spotify exclusive. And the idea is that over time, you'll end up with a universe in which more and more podcasts are proprietary database entries in Spotify's record. And so anyone who wants to hear a podcast will become a Spotify user. And so anyone who wants to make a podcast will have to become a Spotify podcaster. And they'd have lots of leverage, right? They could say, oh, I know you've got your own ad broker here, but it's our patrician duty to our beloved Spotify customers to make sure you're not advertising something that rips them off. So you're going to have to use our ad broker, right? And you're going to have to use our subscription management tools and, just every way that they can intervene in your business to shift more value from your side of the ledger to theirs. The invisible hand reaches down with its eraser and erases a 0 off their side of the ledger, picks up the pencil and draws a 0 on the other side of the ledger, and make more money for themselves. So it is enclosable with enough market power, with enough access to the capital markets. And, one thing Spotify has is a lot of market power and a lot of access to the capital markets, and it's able to do a bunch of this leverage stuff. So, one of the things that makes Spotify eligible to even run this scam is there are a bunch of people who have a podcatcher on their device and also have a Spotify client so they can listen to music. And when Spotify says, oh, we'll just import the file from your podcatcher, and you can just collapse those down to one. That's a very easy sell, as opposed to, hey, person who's never heard of Spotify, you should download Spotify because this one podcaster you like is a Spotify exclusive. That's a much harder sell. And so they figured out a way to leverage one part of their business to suck in another part of their business. And again, this is like, if you're a consumer, this may sound great. It's very convenient. There is nothing wrong with having a single client that does all of this. You know, there's once a company that let you read all of your Facebook messages and all your LinkedIn messages and all your tweets in one file format, one interface called Power Ventures. Facebook reviewed reduced them to radioactive rubble with a bunch of lawsuits. There's nothing wrong with that. The only problem is when you can't escape, right? When the walled garden becomes a prison, right? When you get to that pivotal scene in The Watchmen where I'm not trapped in here with you and you're trapped in here with me, you know?
And that's what's fascinating about the podcasting play, because we're seeing that choke pointification playing out in real time right now. And the question is, are we going to allow it to happen yet again? Or is this time, are the frogs going to take a really good long look at that pot before they climb in?
It's a great question. And what you're describing is, to my mind, is even a highly sort of inherently distributed platform that you describe when it comes to podcasting as an example, even that can be choke pointed with enough capital, with enough corporate and market power behind it. And what it really says is that really, in a lot of ways, there's no market that is fully immune from what you're describing, whether it's creative endeavors, whether it's producing physical products or the like, that this is actually now a feature, not a bug of our entire economy.
What I would say is that it's not that there is no market. It's just that there's no market that's compatible with like Federalist Society style laissez-faire that is also going to remain competitive, right? The Federalist Society kind of wants to have its cake and eat it too. They're like, that we can have competition, but that competition will arrive sort of spontaneously through a kind of spiritual phenomenon that we can never put our finger on, not from having a regulator that says you can't buy that company because then we wouldn't have as much competition. And we can absolutely, like, we know how to do this, right? Like, that's the reason I'm quibbling with you here is because I don't want to give listeners the impression that this is a lost art. Like, how do you build pyramids without power tools, right? We did this like 40 years ago.
Right,
we can do it again tomorrow. It's not rocket surgery, right? We know how to make it happen.
The book is called Chokepoint Capitalism, How Big Tech and Big Content Captured Creative Labor Markets and How We'll Win Them Back. As I said at the top, it is a fantastic book. I even am on apparently the front of the book saying that it is a terrific book because I got an early copy of it and was really taken from it. The authors, Cory Doctorow, Rebecca Giblin, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.